All right. Hi, everyone. Welcome to CSCW 2022. I know in your view, you can't see how many other participants are here, but we have over 50 right now, and that number continues to rise. Just want to quickly introduce ourselves. My name is Gary Shea.
My name is Tony Tang.
And we're the general co-chairs of this conference. Now, before we get into the opening session, we did want to spend a couple of minutes to show our support for the women of Iran. As many of you may know, the Iranian people have been fighting an unprecedented fight for women's rights and human rights since the killing of the 22-year-old Kurdish woman, Mahsa Amini, on September 16th by the morality police for allegedly not covering her hair enough. Widespread protests continue to take place across the country led by women, and to date, over 300 people have been killed and over 14,000 arrested. As outsiders to the community, it may feel like there isn't much we can do to help. Our Iranian CSCW community members have helped us put together a number of things that we can do. This includes reaching out to Iranians in our communities, continue to check in on them, ask if they would like to talk about what's going on and provide that space, be their voice and help sustain the flow of information. And as researchers, designers, and technologists, we need to also hold our social media platforms accountable to moderate content aligned with human rights values and understand uprising socio-political contexts. As educators, there are also a number of things that we can do to help support students in Iran. This includes waiving application fees, giving them more time for completing applications, considering alternatives, TOEFL exam, and waiving the GRE exam requirement if your school still needs it. And as a small commitment, we would like all of you to just take some time to read about what's happening and consider ways to support. Here are some sources of information that's been recommended by our community members. Now, to begin the conference, we'd like to first thank our many sponsors and organizers. First, we'd like to thank SIGCHI and ACM. We'd like to then thank our champion sponsor, Meta. Our benefactors, Google and Adobe. And our friends, the Underwood Institute, Perfect, and Cyberlink. It's a little bit weird to be doing this clapping virtually, but and this conference would not be possible without the hard work of our organizing committee members. And let's also take a second to thank them all. Now, 4 years ago, we came up with a plan to combine two of our favorite things together, the CSCW community and Taiwan. What we were noticing was an active and growing group of HCI scholars in Taiwan and Asia in general, doing really strong work, but may not be familiar with CSCW and social computing. And so we proposed to host this conference as a way to help build up the CSCW community there and help bridge the communities. And a lot of effort has been put into this community building over the past few years. We've held 2 rounds of winter schools, one in Kyoto, Japan, and one in Taipei and virtually. And as you know, the global pandemic has complicated our plans, but through these efforts, we were able to work with more than 65 mentees and 20 plus mentors. And it's really great to see a number of these mentees participating at this CSCW and doing well in their programs. And in addition to scholarship, we also envision this as an opportunity to introduce you all to the Taiwanese culture, including the food, as well as the various sites of Taiwan. And today, we're delivering on that promise and bringing you the world famous Rauhe night market to you virtually, unfortunately.
Right, so we're virtual again this year. Earlier this year, we faced the difficult problem of planning for a conference where the host country was still requiring substantial quarantines on entry. Unfortunately, I couldn't convince the organizing committee that attendees would be willing to quarantine for 14 days to attend CSCW 2022, so we decided to move it virtual. The past 2 years have taught us some valuable lessons we took into designing this conference experience. We know that 8-hour synchronous online conferences are very difficult to attend. Yet at the same time, these conferences and meeting others is extremely important for emerging scholars as they build their careers. We know that online conferences ease the burden of participation for many who cannot or have a hard time traveling. We've also seen just how important it is to conduct ourselves respectfully online and to ensure our discourse is civil and appropriate. CSCW 2022 was built off these learnings that we have required in the past 2 years. As you know, the conference is 2 weeks long. 2 weeks! Yeah, 2 weeks. So bolded here are the main synchronous events for the main program. These are designed as must-see TV events. These happen for 2 hours apiece every Tuesday at 10 a.m. and 10 p.m. Taiwan time. Posters and demos happen also as a synchronous event on Monday at 10 a.m. and 10 p.m. Our paper authors have prepared pre-recorded videos of their presentations. These are organized into sessions and live streamed for the CSCW TV watch party. This live stream is like a TV channel. You can tune in and tune out as your schedule allows. You can watch this inside of the GatherTown space, which will allow you to hang out with others and interact with them. Or you can watch on a YouTube link that has been sent out by email, or that will be sent out by email. Each paper will be presented twice, once each week at a 12-hour offset. To interact with authors, we encourage you to use Discord, which will allow you to asynchronously interact with the authors, attendees, and others in the community. So who is the community? Well, we currently have 725 plus attendees registered, about half of whom are students and 80 of whom are non-ACM members. We are supported by 106 excellent student volunteers, and our attendees have registered from 40 countries across 6 continents. This perhaps goes without saying. If you want to be a CSCW hero in the future, get a job at an institution in Antarctica so you can register from there. You would be part of CSCW lore forever. Our community is important to us. I want to remind you of the ACM CSCW Code of Conduct that you each agreed to when you registered for CSCW. Briefly, we expect professional behavior from all attendees as we are committed to providing a harassment-free experience for everyone. We do not tolerate any form of harassment. Any member can report violations, and we encourage peers and senior members to do so on behalf of colleagues who may not be in a position to comfortably do so. SIG Chi Cares exists to serve as a resource for people who experience discrimination or harassment. These are approachable people that will help people with the accountability process. We're thankful to Andrea, Helena, and Carrie, who have agreed to serve as representatives for SIG Chi Cares at CSCW 2022. We'll make the slide deck available after the session for folks to take down the contact information. As a virtual conference, we will rely on a lot of different technology. Please make use of the SIG Chi program as your main hub for interacting with CSCW. It contains links to all of the events, as well as links to papers and the ACMDL for each of the pieces of content at the conference. One really neat thing is that the program understands your time zone. So in preparation for this session, it looks like it starts at 10 a.m. for me, whereas for Gary, it starts at 6 p.m. on November the 7th. In all of our communications with you, we will refer to times in Taiwan time, but as many of you are not operating in Taiwan time zone, please refer to the program as it understands your time zone and can do the conversion for you. The program also provides links to events. For this event, for instance, you may have found this on-air link that brought you here. We will make sure that such on-air links are available for each synchronous event. For CSCW TV paper sessions, you can view these in the GatherTown space, and we are just working on getting those links up for those sessions as well. So please use the SIG Chi program app. One thing to note, the ACM DL links do not yet work, and we hope to get these to work in a couple of days. We're just working with Sheridan to make sure that this all gets up in time. Our conference will make use of 3 pieces of technology. We're currently on Zoom, which will be for the plenary panels and lasting impact award session. You can use GatherTown for the posters and demos reception, as well as the long-running CSCW TV watch party. And when you want to engage in asynchronous conversations with authors and other attendees, we invite you to the Discord. This has been set up with channels for each paper session, and you'll find a number of other social channels there as well. You will find the invite to the Discord in your email. As this is a long-running event, we will provide you with regular updates and reminders through email. We have 10 planned emails, so get those spam filters ready. I now hand it over to our paper chairs, or 2 of our paper chairs, Katarina Reinecke and Hideaki Kuzuoka, who will discuss the paper program.
Hi, everybody. Yeah, I'm one of 4 papers chairs. My name is Katarina Reinecke. And I was paper co-chair with Naomi and Hideaki and Hao Chuan Wang. But we were actually working very closely together with 8 wonderful editors, with Sue and Irina, Sean, Vera, Sharon, John, Andres, and Morgan. You can see there was a huge team. And we actually had more than 140 ACs who also were working with us to put this program together. So thank you to all of these people who were helping us with this. Now, some of you probably noticed that for 2022, we changed from a quarterly submission model to just having 2 submission cycles per year, plus also 2 additional revised submission cycles. And we also decided to shorten AC cycles to reduce burnout. That was a big issue for us to address. Now, what was exciting to us was that we got a record number of submissions, 783 in total in the July 2021 and also in the January 2022 cycles, so altogether. And of those, 220 papers have been accepted to date and 97 papers are still under review. What you'll now see at CSCW in the next few days are 343 papers from 4 previous submission cycles, which we packed into a total of 60 sessions. Now, we really promise it's an exciting program, and Hideaki will provide some more details.
Okay, so I'm going to show you 2 graphs about the accepted papers. The first graph, which seems to be following the Zipf's law, shows how primary paradigm of the papers are distributed. As you can see here, systems, design, and theory are only 8.4%, 5.2%, and 2.9% respectively. On the other hand, 45% of the papers are qualitative. Next, please. And the second graph shows the regional categorization of the accepted papers. As you can see, more than half of the papers are coming from North America, and Europe is 63, and Asia 37, and so on. So we hope more and more papers to be submitted from all the regions in the world. Okay, this is all from Paper Chairs. Thank you.
This year, we have 3 best papers. These represent significant achievements and standout contributions as the top 1% of submissions to CSCW. We invite you to look for these papers in the program, marked with this icon, and to congratulate the authors when you see them. CSCW also recognizes an additional 9 papers with the Honorable Mention Awards, which represent the top 3% of submissions. We also have 7 papers winning Impact Awards, work that represents or has a clear potential for real-world or practical impact. 6 papers have been recognized with Method Awards, which have developed or explained or implemented methods or methodological innovation. Finally, we recognize 11 papers for their contributions to diversity or inclusion, outstanding work that focuses on or serves minorities, excluded individuals or populations, or intervenes in systematic structures of inequality. All of these papers are also marked with their respective icons, which you will find in the SIGCHI program. I'm excited to say that our posters and demo reception, which will happen on November 14th, will feature 38 posters and 20 demos. This will happen in the GatherTown space, where you will get to interact with the authors and other attendees. As I was beta testing this space, my 9-year-old son accused me of playing video games without him. He subsequently took over the keyboard, interacted with several SBs, and watched several of the poster and demo videos. GatherTown is fun, and we look forward to seeing you there as well. We also welcome 12 students forming the Doctoral Consortium cohort and 6 workshops running this coming weekend. Finally, I want to introduce the new Emerging Scholars program, which, with the support of 7 senior colleagues in the community, will hold AMAs in smaller, intimate gatherings. Our lasting Impact Award session will be run on the last Tuesday of the conference, chaired by Pamela Hines. The awardees this year are Bob Kraut, Carmen Egaido, Jolene Gallagher for their CSCW 1988 paper, Patterns of Contact and Communication in Scientific Research Collaboration. Finally, I want to thank TaiKai's participation at this year's conference. We welcome several poster and demo contributions during the poster and demo reception, and we want to thank the virtual environments team for building the GatherTown space such that it reflects Taiwan. I'll now hand it over to Aaron.
All right, thanks, Tony. Hi, everyone. I'm Aaron Jing. 我的中文名字是江嘉伦. I'm one of the virtual chairs with my co-chairs Sue Fussell, Sharon Ding, Corey Jackson, EJ Lee, and Carrie Malari. And I'm going to quickly introduce the social events that we have planned for you this year. First, it was great to see a lot of you at the welcome reception in the Gathertown space. And I actually got to experience a lot of the in-person conference interactions, like how you could just bump into someone you know, or join a group conversation ad hoc, or even, you know, that awkwardness that when you're in a group and suddenly no one's talking, but you also kind of don't want to be the first one to leave. But overall, I think it's really cool that I was able to capture the full range of experience. So if you haven't logged into the Gathertown space, I highly encourage you to check that out. Next slide. We also have a lot more social events planned for you throughout the conference, like last speed dating is exactly what it sounds like. It's speed dating, but for the whole research labs groups. So what happens here is that you fill this really short sign-up form and tell us a little bit about your research group. And we'll match your research group with another group for a meet and greet. This is something we started last year, and we heard just really good feedback from a lot of the participants. So we're continuing this program this year. You do need to sign up to participate. The sign-up form is right here on the screen. You can either scan the QR code or you can go to this link at the bottom. Next slide. All right, Discord. Text chat is surprisingly something that never really worked when we're using like the conference platform. We're using the conference platforms, but this year on Discord, it actually works, and it works great. We have a range of topics prepared for you, whether you want to just talk about research or connect with the other folks in your cohort, or just post cat photos. Next slide. I also want to highlight the introduce yourself channel on Discord. Regardless whether you are a newcomer or an old timer to the community, it is always a great idea to post a short self intro so the community can learn a little bit more about you. There's already a lot of activities on Discord, so I definitely encourage everyone to check that out. Next slide. And last but certainly not least, we also have the virtual coffee hours organized by Who to Chat, which is a really cool tool built by our friends at MIT. There will be two coffee hour sessions, both on November 16th, that's the Taiwan time, or November 15th, Pacific time. These times are posted on our website as well as on the online program. Next slide. Yeah, and again, this is just a quick overview of the social events for CSCW 2022. We want to provide a lot of opportunities for forming and maintaining meaningful connections and interactions, and we hope there's something for everyone. If you want to learn more about the details, you can go to the social events page on the conference website. Back to you, Tony.
Actually, thanks, Aaron. Well, I hope you all are as excited as I am about the program that we have planned for you. And today, right now, it is our pleasure to introduce to you our keynote speaker, Professor Balaji Parthasarathi. He is a professor at the International Institute of Information Technology, Bangalore, and a co-founder of the Institute's Center for Information Technology and Public Policy. His interests are rooted in economic geography and economic sociology, and he explores the relationship between technological changes and innovation, economic globalization, and global and social transformation, especially in underprivileged contexts. His publications have spanned the organization of production in the global software industry to the political economy of e-governance, e-waste, and social innovation. His current work examines the opportunities and constraints afforded by the digital platform economy. Now, everyone, please welcome our keynote speaker. And while he's setting up the slides, I want to know, just for questions, please post them via Zoom. You see there's a Q&A button. Tony and I will be monitoring them, and we'll ask your questions during the Q&A session immediately after the talk.
Thank you. Am I audible? Yeah, great. Thank you. It is customary and courtesy to thank one's host when one is invited to give any talk. But when I've been invited to deliver the keynote at a flagship conference of the leading professional society of a discipline about which I know little, never mind claim any expertise in, it truly is an honor. So thank you, Gary. Thank you, Tony, for the invitation, and thank you to the entire CSCW community. What I'd like to present before you today is a provocation that I hope will get the community sort of in a self-reflective mode and also get it to think about future research directions and questions. So on that note, as an outsider, I first decided to familiarize myself with the community and learned that it was in 1984 that the term CSCW was even coined, right? For a workshop focused on understanding and supporting collaboration. And it was in 1986 that the first conference on collaborative possibilities was actually held. But the scope of CSCW has since broadened, and I'm drawing on this quote, which said, the terms computer, supportive, cooperative, and work have all been transcended. CSCW now encompasses collaboration that uses technologies we do not call computers, collaboration in which technology plays a central rather than a support role, uses that involve conflict, competition, or coercion rather than cooperation, and studies of entertainment and play. So this led me to ask the following question. Now, as CSCW has blossomed, how has coercion emerged as a possibility alongside cooperation? Now, it is to sort of explore an answer to this question that this presentation will examine how the conjunctural configuration of social and technological changes over the past quarter century have led to the rise of digital labor platforms and their coercive relationship with gig workers. Specifically, the emergence of coercion under the guise of flexibility and its four dimensions that have been identified in the literature. Now, I'll get to sort of talking about these four dimensions in greater detail later on in the presentation. Now, gig work itself, according to the ILO, is a non-standard form of employment that, that designates all employment that is definite and neither full-time nor part of a subordinate or bilateral employment relationship. Now, why study gig platforms, right? Or digital labor platforms and gig work on them? Now, one reason, again, to draw on ILO data is that in the decade between 2010 and 2020, the number of digital platforms actually went up by more than a factor of 5, from roughly 142 to 777. And global revenues had hit 52 billion. And most of those platforms, 40% or more, are actually in the US, India, and the UK. Now, according to the sociologist Manuel Castells, while a link between work and technology is a complex interaction within a social system, that complex interaction involving management decisions, systems of industrial relations, cultural and institutional environments, and government policies, the argument here is that gig work, more often than not, does not deliver what the ILO terms as decent work. And when the ILO talks about decent work, what it's really referring to is work that's productive, ensures equality of opportunity and treatment for men and women, delivers a fair income, security in the workplace, social protection, opportunities for personal development, and the opportunity to express one's concerns, to organize, and to participate in decisions that affect working lives. Okay, it's against this backdrop that the presentation will take the following structure. What I'll do next is to briefly examine platforms and their significance before moving on to look at what I call the macro foundations of coercion and then the micro foundations of coercion. Now, the macro and the micro foundations of coercion will be understood or will be framed through the 4 dimensions of flexibility that I mentioned earlier. Following that, I'll look at gig work in the platform economy in India, which will be the main sort of case study where a lot of the empirical evidence will be provided. And then the presentation will end with a few reflections and questions. Okay, the platform economy and its significance. Now, platforms basically provide the basic infrastructure to mediate between different groups, right? And they extract value from interactions between those who offer services and those who are looking for them. For economists, our platforms are at the heart of what they call two-sided markets, and these exhibit 2 types of network effects. First, a same side effect when increasing the number of users on one side of the network makes it either more or less valuable for users on the same side. And then there is a cross-side effect, which is when increasing the number of users on one side of the network makes it more or less valuable to users on the other side. And you have sort of platforms manifesting themselves in various ways. You have, for instance, manufacturing platforms when you have shared components, processes, knowledge, people, etc., coming together in sort of various combinations to provide product and service variety by exploiting economies of scale and scope. And then, of course, you have innovation platforms where you have the development of new products and services, typically around shared standards. And this is something that we're very familiar with in the world of computing. And then you have transactions platforms, which are intermediaries or marketplaces that permit the exchange of goods and services. Now, these typically facilitate exchanges that would otherwise not occur. And the more participants and functions on a transaction platform, the more useful it is. Now, transaction platforms are not necessarily new. So you have, for example, the photograph of the souk in Fez in Morocco, and you also have a bazaar in the Charminar area of Hyderabad in India. And what is it that actually goes on in these places? In order to illustrate that, I draw on one of my favorite poems by Sarojini Naidu, which was written more than a century ago, where she says, or where she asks, "O ye merchants, what is it that you're actually here to sell?" Right? Or she asks the fruitmen, what are the fruits, the citron, the pomegranate, and the plums that you bring to bear? Or the musicians, the sitar, the sarangi, and various other instruments. In other words, what Sarojini Naidu is sort of narrating or asking to this poem to the various vendors, what is it that they bring to the bazaar, and what are the kinds of customers that they in turn are drawing for transactions to actually take place. Now, while the souk in Fez or the Charminar area of Hyderabad represent sort of more traditional platforms, with digital technologies, platforms have emerged in the form of online marketplaces that involve at least 3 parties, where the platform provider serves as an intermediary, coordinating supply and demand of the other 2 parties. Right? Now, what these platforms are really doing is that they're lowering transactions costs, and with what geographers call space-time compression, they've created new work possibilities. And there are 2 broad categories that one can sort of refer to here. First, you have location-based digital labor possibilities, or work on demand via apps, which include, activities such as transport, cleaning, errands, running errands, etc. And these typically work with platforms that are either lean, that i.e. that they provide services with little asset ownership, or they adopt hub-based models. So in the first instance, you have platforms like Uber, for instance, which are very quote unquote asset light, or you also have hub-based models where you have e-commerce platforms like, say, for instance, Amazon, right? Then, of course, the other thing is you have contingent or task or project-based work, which is delivered digitally over the cloud. And here you have a range of sort of work possibilities, ranging from skilled and highly value-added work, say, for example, design, writing software or designing web pages, etc., to the more menial and sort of monotonous work, such as tagging photographs or completing surveys. A variant of this is, of course, micro work, or tasks that are subdivided into very, very tiny units for work which come with equally tiny rewards. To sort of put this diagrammatically and to sort of help us sort of conceptualize, here's a graph where on the x-axis you have what geographers call spatial stickiness, right? And on the y-axis you have temporality or job duration. So on the top, on the right-hand side, you have, which is spatially sticky, long sort of duration, you have traditional waged employment that comes with a variety of sort of benefits, not just sort of long duration, but also typically benefits, social benefits, health benefits, and so on. To the left, you have cloud work characterized by, where there's low spatial stickiness, but you can have sort of long-term engagements, say, for instance, management consultants, those who develop software, etc. To the bottom left, you have cloud work, limited stickiness, and jobs that last for very short periods of time. And to the bottom right, you have location-specific or geographically tethered work that is spatially sticky, but these are essentially gigs or tasks that one undertakes very briefly. And it is the location-specific or geographically tethered work that this presentation is going to primarily focus on. Again, with this, we now move on to the macro foundations of cohesion. Now, long before computer science started thinking about cooperation or cooperative work, the social sciences have been thinking about the division of labor. So if you go back to the work of Adam Smith, he describes the productivity gains from workers collaborating in pin production as opposed to producing the pins individually. And in the mid-19th century, Marx talked about a division of labor between the owners of property, that is the bourgeoisie, and the proletariat, who had nothing but their labor power to sell, in sort of sustaining industrial capitalism with the help of the state. And I'll talk about that shortly. Then you had Emily Durkheim, the sociologist, who talked about how societies with diverse economy are bound by what he called organic solidarity, with an interdependence fostered by complementary work, backed by a legal contractual framework. Now, Durkheim was actually building on the work of other philosophers and theorists like Hobbes, Locke, and Weber, who argued for a central authority to maintain law and order. But in the 20th century, what you see increasingly has been that state legitimacy and the social contract have sort of extended beyond the political to bringing about a process of socioeconomic change, or what we might call development, in aspects such as health, education, and employment. By the late 20th century, however, ideological shifts towards a greater faith in free markets to attain development goals sort of started to dominate. And the proponents were invoking was Smith's idea of the efficient invisible hand of the market over the visible hand of the state. Now, in terms of sort of employment and work, what this ideological shift meant was that a traditional form of work based on full-time employment, clear-cut occupational assignments, and a career pattern over the life cycle is being slowly but surely eroded away. And it has led to a rise in flexible or non-standard working arrangements, including gig work. Remember, we made reference to this earlier. That is, all employment that is definite and neither full-time nor part of a subordinate and bilateral employment relationship. Now, according to Manuel Castells, the rise of gig work to support mobility, productivity, and the profitability of capital has led to the individualization of labor in the labor process. Now, the coincidence of this ideological shift with the spread of the internet from roughly the turn of the millennium have provided the social and technological conjuncture that I referred to earlier for the rise of digital labor platforms offering flexibility. Okay, and with that, we now move on to sort of examining the 4 dimensions of flexibility. We first talk about supply side flexibility and platform work. Now, supply side flexibility refers not just to the supply of labor, but the kind of various demands or the expectations that come with it. Demands or expectations of work time and personal time balance, the portability of rights and entitlement for mobility between jobs. Now, for those who sort of, there's this effort to sort of project platforms as meeting the demands of supply, and by projecting platforms as a revolution in labor markets, suggesting that they can even help lift people out of poverty, right? So it's just a lot of onus has been placed on digital labor platforms. Now, platform work has been being promoted by bodies such as the United Nations Development Program as a means of development, especially in the global south, where a majority of the world's youth population resides, many of whom are either underemployed or trapped in what are called low-quality jobs. And therefore, platforms, it's argued, offer a win-win situation, right? For employers, they gain easy access to specialized skills, more flexible and faster hiring processes, and 24-hour productivity. Workers, on the other hand, can compete in global job markets from anywhere at any time with computer and internet access. Now, this is the story on the supply side. But what really happens on the demand side, that is from the vantage of employers, and what are the possible implications for employers and workers? Now, from the demand side, you have, with the first flexibility condition we look at are the employment conditions or employment flexibility. It essentially gives the employer the right to hire and fire, thanks here to limited state labor protection. And here you see the withdrawal of the state following the ideological shift at play. Now, the employment relationship itself has changed, and as intermediaries, platform providers shift most costs, risks, and liabilities to the other 2 parties, that is the service provider and the customer. Further, despite offering a workforce, which is what platforms would like you to believe, most platforms do not recognize gig workers as employees. Instead, workers are classified as self-employed or as independent contractors, thus minimizing employer responsibility for providing employment benefits. And for the gig worker, there is no guarantee that he or she will not be terminated on the completion of the next gig or task. In other words, gig work becomes a fairly precarious livelihood. Now, this is despite, legal rulings and regulatory initiatives in many parts of the world. But, so for instance, in February 2021, the UK Supreme Court ruled that, Uber drivers in the UK were actually, employees and not really independent contractors. And there have been yet to be adopted initiatives in the floated by the European Commission and more recently by the US Department of Labor. But for the most part, gig workers on digital labor platforms are or continue to be treated as independent contractors, or even better still, entrepreneurs. Now, the second, demand side flexibility pertains to wages, right? Now, from the demand point of view, from the platform's point of view, what it refers to is really the absence of institutions that can limit wage variation through minimum wage or through any form of coordinated wage bargaining. But if you look at the other side of the story, the first photograph, the one on the left, that sort of picks up on a strike in San Francisco last year, where the newspaper article says poverty is not flexibility, right? And as some scholars have pointed out, this kind of sort of wage flexibility is little more than a euphemism for working poverty. And the second photograph on the right, the image on the right, actually, is based on a survey of gig workers in East Asia. And it says, gig workers are uncertain and they're barely scraping by. Now, this is what wage flexibility does for you. Now, having looked at the three dimensions of flexibility, we now move on to the micro foundations of coercion, and we'll talk about the fourth dimension of flexibility. This is also on the demand side, which is what is called functional flexibility, or the ability of platforms to control internal production processes, including work time, job content, and skills. Now, how do platforms exercise such control? This is by embodying an architecture, right? A design for products, services, and infrastructure facilitating network users' interaction, plus a set of rules, that is protocols, rights, and pricing terms that govern transactions, implementation of which can rely on artificial intelligence and machine learning. Now, this is the point of view from the platform point of view. Now, for the workers, what it does is that implementation raises concerns of algorithmic management, right? Work settings where human jobs are assigned, optimized, and evaluated through algorithms and tracked data. And there is also a deeper concern with what Jenna Buttle calls opacity and alienation from the production process by algorithmic management, as workers have no access to the logic behind decisions on their performance evaluation or future opportunities. And we'll see how all this plays out by looking at the case of last mile gig work on digital labor platforms in India. All right. Like I pointed out earlier, India is one of those locations where there is a significant number of digital platforms, and it also, there's a lot of people who are sort of working on them. And I think it would be quite appropriate here, I guess, or fitting, to start with a quote from a recently released report on gig work by Niti Aayog, which is really the think tank of the government of India. And the enthusiasm is evident in the opening paragraph. It says the rapidly burgeoning gig workforce is ushering in a new economic revolution globally. India, with its demographic dividend of 500 million labor force and the world's youngest population, rapid urbanization, widespread adoption of smartphones and associated technology, is the new frontier of this revolution, right? And this report estimated that in 2021, there are about 7.7 million gig workers in the country, about 2.5% of the non-agricultural workforce, about 2.7 of whom were in retail, and about 1.3 in transportation-related activities. And the estimate is that this number will go up at least 3 times over the next few years. By the end of this decade, constituting about 6.7% of the non-agricultural workforce. Now, in order to understand the specific conditions under which this rapidly growing gig force actually is sort of how this rapidly growing gig force is experiencing gig work, this section will draw on about 4 years of work of study of platform work at IIIT Bangalore. Specifically, it'll draw on interviews that we've been conducting. We've conducted with more than 1,150 workers, or roughly that many, across the country. Interviews with many platforms and their representatives, and with other stakeholders like representatives from the world of trade unions, from the policy world, and so on. Now, let's take a quick look at where and how labor supply for the gig economy is being made available in India. So if you look at this particular bar chart, you'll notice that between 1991 and 2016, employment in agriculture declined pretty sharply, right? And most of that went either to manufacturing or even more so to services. And in services, you will notice these smaller bars within the big bar. Most of them have gone either to trade or to transport and storage. These are the two dominant subsectors of services. And recall that this is what the Niti Aayog had also pointed out to, right? Most of them are in retail and transportation, that is trade and transportation. Okay. Now, if you take a closer look at these numbers in terms of productivity or in terms of the education levels of workers, you'll notice that trade, transportation, storage are the relatively, have relatively low productivity in rupee terms compared to, say, business or financial services. And further, if you look at the pie charts on the top, they indicate the levels of education, right? And you will notice that a smaller percentage of workers have actually completed secondary education, right? That is the light blue color, than in, say, business services or in financial services. In other words, you have a relatively low productive segment with workers who have relatively low levels of education, a majority of whom have not completed secondary schooling. And one last slide in this connection. If you just look at the first two boxes on the left, you'll see that over a period of time, say between 2000 and 2012, the proportion of regular employment with social protection has declined in the country, again, indicative of the withdrawal of the state or the state's inability to provide the necessary protection. Simultaneously, the proportion of regular employment without social protection has actually gone up quite sharply, right? So this is the sort of the broad picture in terms of labor supply in the country. But at the same time, what has happened is that the labor in the country has now become armed with mobile phones, like the Niti Aayog report said. And in a country where telephone penetration was barely 3 per 100, even in the, say, early 2000s, that number has gone up to about 90%. That's about 90 out of 100 inhabitants in the country now access to a phone. And we now have over 700 million internet broadband connections or subscriptions in the country. So what that does, it sets up the basis, the infrastructural basis, if you will, for gig work on digital platforms. So you have the available labor, and now you have the infrastructure that is also available. So with this sort of a labor supply, here come the digital platforms offering work. And here is something, here's an advertisement from Uber, says, why drive with us? And what does it promise? Set your own hours. It's flexible, right? You decide when and how often you drive. Get paid fast. Weekly payments directly into your bank account, right? And get support at every turn. If there's anything that you need, you can reach us at any time. Now, we will examine these claims in a little more detail. And here's another sort of poster from Dunzo, which is a hyperlocal courier. It says, ride and earn more with Dunzo. Easy to become a Dunzo partner. All you have to do is download the app, provide a few basic details about yourself, and hey, you're in business, right? And you know, this does appeal to a lot of people for various reasons. And I have one quote here from a 36-year-old mother of two, said, look, I'm a tailor who works from home, right? We work for merchants who give us work, but they don't pay us even after 45 days. And like she says, we need money immediately to pay for rent and other needs. And I heard about Swiggy, which is a food delivery platform, through my brother's friend. Wanted to try it since they pay every week and we get cash in hand from COD orders, which provides immediate relief. And indeed, in a study that we did in 2020 of 53 workers on the primary motivation for working on digital labor platforms, a little more than a third mentioned pay or regular pay, and a third mentioned flexibility in work. In other words, being able to work when you want and so on. Now, this is the hope and expectation with which this work is offered and workers actually get onto the platforms. What happens afterwards can be a slightly different story. Employment flexibility. Okay. From supply side, we move to employment flexibility. Now, here's a headline which says, for gig workers, labor rights and benefits remain elusive in India, right? Now, over the past 2 or 3 years, the Indian Parliament passed 4 major labor codes, consolidating a variety of labor laws. And of them, only the Code on Social Security makes reference to platform or gig workers. But as being outside of a traditional employer-employee relationship, which effectively treats workers or continues to treat workers as entrepreneur partners of platforms with few benefits. Now, the COSS, although it does, talk about long-term benefits and so on, is not yet operational. So, platforms are therefore off the hook and not mandated by law to provide any social security or health benefits to their workers. Now, here are a couple of examples of how this sort of flexibility actually plays out in practice. And I've taken an extract from Zomato, another food delivery platform, a clause which says the delivery partner is not entitled to claim reimbursement of hospitalization or hospital bills that may be incurred by the partner while rendering delivery services or incurred by family members for any unfortunate accident or severe illness during the subsistence of agreement and these delivery partner terms and conditions. Basically, if something happens to you while you're delivering a food parcel, good luck, you're on your own, right? What platforms also do here is that they often rely on third-party labor contractors, such as Shadowfax and TeamLease, and really treat them as what Marx might call a reserve army, to not only meet demand surges, but also as a means of keeping a lid on piecework rates and as a credible threat to replace striking workers. Now, let's move on to wage flexibility. Again, let's start with a newspaper headline. It says, India's gig workers overworked and underpaid. Now, of the 4 labor codes that I referred to earlier, one of them is the Code on Wages. And guess what? There's no mention of platform or gig workers in that code at all, right? And in annual studies of the 11 largest platforms in the country that we've conducted at IIITV through the Fair Work Project in 2020 and 2021, we found that only 4 platforms offer local minimum wage after work-related costs, right? Then is there any surprise that another survey reinforces the point by saying gig workers are indeed on the rise. There are more people who are embracing it, but most gig workers live a hand-to-mouth existence. Now, how do wages really become flexible, right? Now, if you sort of crack open this, the key, as this headline points out, is that incentive pay, which is so central to what workers get, is a method of control, right? And to the left, you see a screenshot of a Zomato worker's weekly earnings. And you'll see at the bottom, I don't know if it's clear to everybody, he has of the total earnings for the week of 10,000 odd rupees, close to 6,000 is the auto pay, the rest are incentives. In other words, weekly incentives form 45% of your take-home pay. Now, what the reliance on incentive for earnings does is that it forces workers to spend long hours. 15, 16, 18 hours are not unheard of. And they do so because there's also no compensation for time spent between gigs when you're waiting for work, right? And here is a quote from an Ola driver who says, Ola, of course, is Uber's competitor in India, who says, even if I'm 50 paisa short of the target, they do not give my incentive. But I have to continue working because I have no other choice. I have to eat, right? So essentially, if you don't meet the target, you keep working longer and longer hours, and that is the nature of flexibility. Now, functional flexibility, right? And here I'll break it down into three parts. The first part is work contracts. And here workers say, the agreement is in English. If the platform explains to us that they are changing a certain scheme in the contract, we can oppose only if we understand. If we don't understand the contract itself, how will we oppose? Right? It's in a language I don't understand. It's possibly in legalese, which I will certainly not understand. Right? And as this headline says, Urban Company Partners. Urban Company is a platform that provides a lot of sort of beauty services in the country. They also provide, repair services like electricians and carpenters and so on. Urban Company Partners protest new subscription-based work scheme. Now, what happened was that Urban Company suddenly changed its contractual conditions in late 2021, and they introduced a minimum guarantee plan, which required workers to pay a monthly subscription fee for guaranteed work. Right? And those opting out of the plan were, ironically enough, placed in something called the flexi category. Why? They would then be unlikely to be offered any work on weekdays. Right? So this is the contractual shift. And more recently, Zomato has launched something called the gig system, okay, which requires workers to book specific time slots in advance of up to 4 days, right? And the availability of time slot depends on ratings, which I'll come to shortly, and how many others are actually seeking those slots. While at the same time, the payments and incentives for each slot varies on a daily basis. So what's paid for you at 7 p.m. today may not be what's paid to you at 7 p.m. tomorrow. In other words, this whole notion of flexibility is being structured for you, right? It's not like you can get on and get off when you want. It's when Zomato wants you to get on and get off. The second part of functional flexibility is what you call data opacity, right? Now, platforms have privacy and data policies, but these are simply incomprehensible to workers for the most part, right? Workers understand that platforms have a lot of data on them, but they don't know exactly what categories of data they have, especially data other than what they themselves have shared when joining, right? Some basic data. Or to what purposes the data is actually put to use. And here I've taken a clause out of Uber's privacy policy, which says we may collect data about devices used to access our services, including hardware models, IP address, other sort of device identifiers, OS and their versions, software, you name it. Pretty much Uber can take any data that it wants. And these are what workers sign on to. Workers neither know how long platforms can keep their documents or data and in what form, not even how to access them. So here a PharmEasy, which actually is a distributor for pharmaceutical products, says no, they keep the original DL, which is the driver's license, and RC, which is the registration certificate of the vehicle, okay, with them. The rest maybe their photocopies. Okay, so you don't know what's happening with that when it's away from you, who's using them, etc. And then platforms also partner with other companies to process worker data, and workers are not informed about who has access to their data. And here's a quote from an Amazon worker in Kochi. He says, when I was on leave, my ID was given to another worker, right? My account was blocked for 3 days when he took a selfie, and then the facial recognition simply did not match my face and his face. I went to the hub to resolve this, and they simply gave me the ID of someone else who was on leave that day. You have no choice when they insist. You must show up for delivery or you give up your ID. Now, part 3 of functional flexibility, we go to what I call algorithmic opacity. Now, platforms frequently use ratings of workers by customers, and workers need a minimum rating to continue to receive work. And here's a quote from a project that we did in 2021. Now, urban company workers reported enduring difficult conduct from customers because their ratings were on the line. This is from a beauty worker who's gone to a customer house, right? One reported that she was asked to perform certain services on the wife as the husband watched, which made her feel very uncomfortable, so she left. However, the difficult behavior workers encounter is because of customers simply refusing to pay, saying your work was not up to standard. Now, even when workers understand, right, how the rating system works, right, you often don't know why you get certain ratings. But even if you do, most felt that they sort of, having given their best, they could not really control any outcome beyond that. There's really a sense of resignation and helplessness with the rating system. But unfortunately, it actually influences how work gets allocated to you. And platforms use algorithms for workforce management, but workers simply don't know how the rapidly changing decisions are made, right? So you have a Swiggy worker who says, I was just 13 rupees away from my incentive threshold. I waited till 1 a.m. There were 20 people with me. Some needed only 3 rupees to reach the target and to get the incentive, right? They won't even give you an order. It's like that. They won't give it to you. No incentive. If they do that, we lose, sir. In other words, platforms manipulate how and when you are given work as you approach the threshold for an incentive. That's algorithmic management work. Workers often don't know why that happens when it happens. And workers don't have easy access to a human representative when they do not understand such automated decisions. When there is an issue, there's no helpline number. When you fill the form with what is your issue, then it is their will when they will call, right? There's no number here. The team will call back, but they will call back whenever they like. Sometimes it takes even 2 days. This is another Swiggy worker in 2021 from Delhi. And here's another very interesting case, right? Of a Uber driver who lost his job for, faulty algorithmic software, right? Or AI software, sorry. So essentially what happened was this driver on the left, that is this picture, went to a major pilgrimage center, and as is common in India, got his head tonsured. But when he came back, the system did not recognize him for who he was, right? And he complained and he was blocked. His ID was blocked. He was not allowed to drive with Uber. So Sheikh Salahuddin, who's the head of the Indian Federation of App-Based Transport Workers, a leading union, said, why wasn't the driver informed about the real reason why his ID was blocked? Because the platform came back and said, no, he violated certain community guidelines, not because he tonsured his head. Don't find fault with our software, right? But then Sheikh asked, do you need 34 days to even say that this is a case of community guideline violation? Right? Couldn't you have said that immediately, right? So these are the kinds of sort of issues that workers face. I know this is functional flexibility for you. So on that note, sort of let me conclude this presentation with a few thoughts and sort of reflections. Now, in an era when the sort of the free market has become the leitmotif with the call for quote unquote flexible labor markets, technology in the form of digital labor platforms is a handmaiden. But while platforms have opened up a new channel of work opportunities, flexibility is no free lunch, right? Instead, it limits demand and understanding of the social conditions in which platforms are embedded. Now, the aspirations of cooperation in the CSCW community through micro-level technology or platform design have been nudged by the macro social circumstance towards coercion. So I'm going to sort of end with a call for professional activism by the CSCW community, and that call will take the form of a few questions. Now, to resist the nudge, can we think about, certain audit processes and mechanisms? Can these mechanisms be designed to ensure that platforms follow data practices and procedures that ensure the confidentiality, security, and comprehensibility of their workers' data? Can they be designed to ensure that algorithms used by platforms guarantee operational equity and non-discrimination as defined by local laws? Now, is there possibly a need for a professional cadre with specific skill requirements to conduct and oversee such algorithmic audits? How can data minimization be combined with informed consent, purpose limitation, and data access rights for the data subject, in this case, the worker? And here, I think the European GDPR gives us many pointers, but then unfortunately, that kind of coverage is not available in most other parts of the world. Finally, resisting the nudges, outreach to workers and regulators. How might platforms provide easy access to suitably anonymized worker data, such as earnings and active hours on the platform, most of which are actually fairly hard for the worker to obtain, either proactively or when requested by workers, worker groups, and regulators. So when can this data be made available? How can it be made available in comprehensible forms? Can periodic transparency reports outline the data categories and inputs used in specific processes such as work allocation be made publicly available by the platforms? And such a report, importantly, will clearly specify instances in which workers are being subjected to automated decision making, mandate human interventions when automated decisions prove unsatisfactory. So these are just a few thoughts that I'm throwing out to the CSCW community. I'm no expert, I'm an outsider, so I offer really no solutions, but I think all I can do is offer some food for thought. And on that note, let me conclude this presentation. I look forward to your questions and feedback. Just a small note that this is really not a solo effort. There's some fantastic colleagues with whom I've had the privilege of working, and an absolutely brilliant team over the years. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Balaji. Thank you so much for this thoughtful talk. And I've personally really appreciated sort of the detailed explanation and thinking through both the macro and the micro forces that's at play here. As we're waiting for folks to submit their questions, and please, use the Q&A to ask your questions, I guess I'll start and just really want to use this chance to sort of hear about your trajectory as well. Sort of how did you get interested in exploring and studying digital platform economy?
Okay, so the thing is, for me, a lot of these things are not planned. These are accidental in a manner of speaking. And one of the nice things about being in India is that every time I commute to work or go back home, I just look out of the bus and I see so many interesting things happening around me, right? And over the last few years, you've seen a surge in these sort of delivery platforms, and you read about it in the press. Or, things are not quite okay. And then you say, can we go beyond journalistic accounts to start interrogating them? You see people with 2 interviews and then they sort of come to sweeping conclusions. So that is what got me interested. And I've long been interested, throughout my career in the relationship between technology and what kind of social transformations it can bring about. And you realize that it has both a utopian and dystopian sides to it. And this is, I guess, one of those dystopian sides. Yeah.
So to follow on that a little bit, like, to what extent do the platforms that enable gig economy to function, to what extent does that change things, and to what extent does it just allow the existing ways of functioning to persist? Like, I was thinking as you were talking that certain kinds of gig economy always existed, right? It was just sort of called working under the table, right? So to what extent is this continuing to be working under the table where neither the employee or the employer are, called to account for the work or the transaction that's happened?
Yeah, the thing is, even within the sort of the digital when you have digital platform, there's parts of it that are not very visible. In a sense, a lot of the workers are made invisible through various sort of, strategies of flexibility that platforms actually adopt, right? And the platforms themselves are visible in the sense that they are sort of, often in the news because they generate tons of money that comes in as venture capital and to sort of, to support their activities. Never mind that almost all of them in India have never seen like 1 penny in terms of profit, right? Now, the reality is that what these platforms offer are alternate work opportunities in an economy where, work is in relatively short supply. However, the problem is these platforms have so much of capital and technology at their disposal that there's a significant asymmetry between the way they work and how they're actually able to treat their workers, especially in the absence of a regulatory framework or structure that is going to kind of, tell them, look, these are certain do's and don'ts. And ultimately, I think people like me are also to blame because we as customers rely on the convenience that these platforms offer. And I call a cab to get to work sometimes, I order food, etc. And part of our research, what we're trying to do here is to say, not to say, let's sort of smash the platforms. That's hardly what we're trying to do here. What we're trying to say is that merely because you're offering work opportunities, that is no excuse for the kind of sort of, sometimes near slave labor-like conditions under which these workers find themselves. So yes, please do sort of operate. And we tell these two platforms when we go talk to them, right? But do change the way in which you engage with your workers. And we're also trying to sort of raise some of the awareness among customers saying, by all means patronize platforms, but why don't you sort of think about what kind of platform you're patronizing? Think about the conditions under which work is done. Do you necessarily need groceries in 10 minutes, like many of these platforms actually promise, right? 10-minute grocery deliveries. When you look at road conditions, traffic conditions, weather conditions, particularly in India, it's absolutely a travesty. We don't mind waiting 15, 20 minutes when a flight is delayed, but you insist on your groceries coming in 10 minutes. It's just astonishing, right? So we are also to blame. So, that's why I said this is like a complex social phenomenon. We are trying to unravel it or parts of it through our research. I hope I answered your question.
Yeah, thank you. Much deeper than the way that I asked it. I'm going to follow up here with a question that came from the audience and sort of augmented a little bit with one of my own questions. You earlier showed a 2x2 matrix between job duration and spatial stickiness. And so I'm going to put in 3 questions here. So do some parts of this 2x2 matrix exhibit more of the problems or more or fewer of the problems? And related to that, are there solutions that perhaps might work better for some of the parts of this matrix than others? And are there better conditions in some parts of the matrix than others for the workers themselves?
Yeah, sure. Now, each of these sort of parts of the matrix come with certain shared issues, and some of them actually unique to them, right? And each come with their set of advantages and drawbacks. Now, let's take, for example, the case of cloud work, whether it's online freelancing, which typically refers to, more highly educated, more high value added activities like software development or web design and even as opposed to sort of micro work where you're doing sort of some tagging, etc. Now, one of the advantages of this, which you cannot overlook, is that it allows certain segments of society who might otherwise find it hard to get work. For example, those who are sort of physically disabled or people who are aged and so on, to actually work out of their homes, or even, maybe young parents who are caring for kids whom they cannot sort of leave and go out of the home. So there are certain advantages out of this. But what also often happens is that if you want sort of the downside of this, particularly in the micro work, and I'm not going to talk about online freelancing because most of these guys are well educated, they can take care of themselves, thank you, right? But if you look at the micro work, what happens is that they often hold auctions for many of these things. So you put in a lot of work, you actually have to sort of click and offer your price at a given time, and then you have to wait and see whether or not the task is assigned to you, right? So there are these, you sit up for long hours, and this is basically like what I was mentioning earlier. You're not paid for time between gigs, right? So you're constantly looking, waiting, and sort of, bidding to take part in these, these sort of small limited scale auctions with work. So there are these sort of, I'm just naming one set of advantages and one set of drawbacks with this. I think with the geographically tethered work, I've sort of elaborated on what the possibilities are. They do offer work opportunities in our urban economies where work is hard to come by, but they come with a whole sort of bag of conditions that workers often don't realize until they actually are ensnared, if that's the term, in that relationship.
I'm going to jump around the order a little bit because I also have this question. I think when you mentioned that in your talk, you mentioned that there are 4 platforms that offer local minimum wage. And I was just curious, from your work, are there actually any good examples of infrastructure that kind of value humans over shareholders now, or, in India or elsewhere that you found to be good examples?
This is almost tongue-in-cheek, Gary, but they don't even value shareholders because none of them making any profit anyway. So there's nothing to distribute to your shareholders, right? So the point is that I think if you look at it, like I mentioned, these geographical tethered platforms can be further broken into 2 categories. One, you have what are these so-called asset-light platforms, so Ubers and Airbnbs and so on and so forth. And then you have those that are based on we sort of rely on hub-based models, like the Amazons, the Flipkarts, Flipkart is actually the Walmart subsidiary in India, or we have another platform called Big Basket, which is a big grocery platform. Now, what happens is that in these so-called asset-light platforms, a lot of their functioning really depends on assets whose costs are transferred to the workers. So the worker buys the cab, the worker buys the motorcycle, or whatever it is that he or she needs to deliver this thing. And it is in cases like that. And in fact, when we talk about minimum wage after cost, we did not even factor in the monthly payments that you need to make for your vehicles, because different vintages, people sometimes own it fully, etc. We were not able to do that from a methodological point of view. But what I'm saying is, especially these asset-light models are the ones where these inequities are most starkly evident. Hub-based models offer are slightly better, right? One of the things that it actually does is, because workers actually have to get to the hubs every morning before their work is allocated to them. Workers get to talk, there's a greater opportunity to mobilize, right? And actually press for some of their demands, right? And these hub-based platforms also tend to be have a better capital and better resources, which allows them to pay a little more. It does not necessarily mean that they always will. Because even within these large platforms, just to take the case of Amazon, You can be a delivery worker. There are 5 different categories of delivery workers you can potentially fall into. Each of these has different conditions, and they call upon these workers depending on demand and supply conditions.
As a quick follow-up to that, just curious, is there any difference between, some of these global platforms versus more local platforms? Are the local platforms more effective at kind of factoring some of the local values, or are they,
Sadly, these local guys are mostly learning from the big boys internationally. They're sort of the aspirational platforms for them. And so typically you have these guys, you see these guys actually imitating many of these practices. See, what happens is over a period of time, because of network externalities, you have to sort of rush and grab your share of the market. Otherwise, you're going to be history. So they try and imitate one another as far as possible. And it's not only the imitation. What has happened over a period of time, especially during and after the pandemic, platforms start to move into other areas. So for example, I might be a ride-hailing platform, but I also start to do food delivery. I also start to do other things, essentially expand the scope of my work. And in so doing, I start to resemble other platforms in a variety of ways, which is also why workers find it very easy to move from one platform to the other. The learning curve is not exactly steep. It's almost, you do almost the same thing.
So I'm going to ask a question from one of our attendees. So Pooja asks, as your excellent presentation shows, platforms hide behind these claims, intentionally using clever words like flexibility that they do not provide to workers. In fact, they take it away. So how can regulatory bodies tackle these claims that may influence highly visible and marketable support from organizations like NITI and the mass onboarding of workers, such as in Uber, Ola in India, where at some point drivers have nowhere else to go?
I mean, first and foremost, I think this whole practice of calling them entrepreneurs and partners is, I would say, an egregious exercise in deceit, right? And these guys are working 15, 16 hours. You have to actually say that, the term, when you say minimum wage, the word minimum has a meaning, right? That you can't go below that. And we actually have documented cases of workers getting a negative income at certain points of time because their costs exceed what it is that they're actually, paid out. Right. So you actually have even situations. So you actually have to ensure, the government has to ensure, for example, through the code on wages, say that, look, these guys must be paid minimum wage. Let's not sort of play around with that. And like I said, if you look at wages, a large component is incentives. Why are you so reliant on incentives that you're actually also using algorithms to say that, oh, as you reach that threshold, I'll make sure you get no further work. Right. So the thing is, reduce the reliance on incentives, make sure that you have reasonably guaranteed work, not by asking them to pay monthly subscriptions, not by saying you have to sign up for work 4 days in advance, when you make a mockery of flexibility, right? So you essentially, these kinds of things are these are the areas where the government can step in, whether it's in the code on wages, the code on sort of industrial relations, where it must strengthen the requirements of what the fundamental relationship between the platform and its workers is all about. The code on social security says, although it's not yet operationalized, says that the government will make contributions to social security, platforms will contribute a certain amount, the workers will contribute a certain amount. But you'll get that when you're 60, 65. But you look at the actual demographics of this group, most of them are between the age of, say, 18 and 30, right? Great, I know I'll get a few benefits, but I'm looking to see what I can take home at the end of the day to put food on my table. I'm not thinking about what I'm going to make when I'm 60 or 65, right? So the government needs to act now and here in terms of regulation and not indulge in this kind of cheerleading about how we are at the bleeding edge of the digital labor platform sort of revolution. And I think as customers also, I think we have to be a little more aware of what it is that we're signing up for, and, not get upset when some guy shows up like, in absolutely dripping in rain, at your own level and saying, look, I'm 3 minutes late. I can't deliver your groceries in 10. I'm doing it like 3 minutes late. And you actually have situations where, workers have been blocked from getting on because of late deliveries. You have discrimination on the basis of caste, on the basis of religion, to which often platforms turn a blind eye unless they are explicitly called out on social media, for instance. So there are these sort of macro decisions that have to be taken at the level of the government and regulations, and then those micro things where we have to sort of push back against the practices of these platforms as customers and say, look, we will not accept this. I admit there's no magic wand, but this is going to take time to, and part of our research is meant to raise that awareness about saying, let's work on this together.
I'll build on that answer a bit and also ask Ellie's question here. From a customer side, it's often hard to tell what we should be looking at, what aspects of the company we might want to hold them accountable, right? And so from that perspective, what are some of the key things that are missing for gig workers that you think are most essential that, it's an absolute, right? Like consistency of work, consistency of pay, healthcare coverage. What are some of the, the things that we should be looking for as customers? Right. We've actually just launched a national survey of customers to sort of complement our study of workers and platforms. And while the results are awaited, there are certain things I think that customers can actually look for and say, look, for instance, in our Fair Work project, we actually score platforms on a scale of 1 to 10, right? So you have other sort of studies that are pointing out to the drawbacks of what these of the operational models of these platforms. And I think as customers, we actually have to think and pause and ask, do I really want to patronize this platform or that? Especially if I know that they are not paying, they're sort of minimum wage deniers, right? And so on. And there are simple things like, are you making sure even if you tip the worker, are you able to make sure that the money actually goes to him or her and is not sort of vanishes down a black hole somewhere in between, right? Are we willing to say, look, I don't mind waiting a few minutes extra for my deliveries. I don't mind sort of this, part of the burden of flexibility is something that, customers must also be open to sort of taking, because if the burden of flexibility, what is happening now, platforms indulge in the rhetoric of flexibility, but the burden of flexibility is actually being borne almost entirely by the workers. So to what extent can we, as consumers who are patronizing them, actually say, okay, we will say, we are fine with this level of flexibility thus far and no further. The thing is, the problem is because customers are not, cannot be represented by a single entity. There's no customer union, like they might have a worker union. You can't, each one comes with different sort of expectations and so on. It's hard to have a one-size-fits-all recommendation for everybody. But nevertheless, these are some broad parameters that research can throw up and people can keep on. It's like a sort of a dashboard. Keep your eye on these things.
Seeing a handful of questions in the about essentially accountability and transparency and governance and stuff like this, and questions about whether we can trust regulatory authorities and things. I think those are difficult questions to try to figure out how to answer. But maybe a little bit more focused would be a question about thinking about how to oversee algorithmic audits, perhaps. And perhaps the question is, where should the skills for the people that are overseeing those kinds of audits come from? What do they need to be trained on? What kinds of things do they need to be aware of?
It's a very relevant and pertinent question. In fact, I went to testify before the Indian Parliament a couple of months ago on this issue, and I recommended to them that they actually set up a committee to determine, what kind of, people, because what kind of composition that committee, the committee should have, because you need people who have an understanding of the law, people who have an understanding of computer science, people who have an understanding of the domain in which this is, ride hailing is not the same as this thing. So I asked that the committee be put together and then say, okay, these are the kind of capabilities that we need in creating a cadre of professionals who can take part in algorithmic audit. Now, I did speak to, there's this organization called GPAI, I think it stands for the Global Partnership on Artificial Intelligence. And I did speak to a couple of the representatives in India. And they said, while that is very important, the whole idea of responsible AI and so on, apparently, even within that community, they're still sort of struggling to see how is it that they can indulge in this kind of the audits. Because part of the problem, I guess, is that the algorithms embody the business logic of companies, and they're not going to part with it. Right? So can we then at least say, what is the kind of data that's going in? What kind of outputs are you then generating? And then see, is this the kind of output you'd like to that you'd like from a social sort of normative point of view? That is this something you're willing to accept? Otherwise, you can tell the company, go back to the drawing board and see what it is that you need to fix, because these kinds of outcomes are not acceptable. Right? So at least, even if we are not able to sort of peer into the black box that companies almost certainly are not going to allow you to do, okay? So for a given set of inputs, what are the kind of outputs you're generating? Are these outputs acceptable to us socially, according to local laws and sort of social expectations? That's about all I think we can do at this point, unless I think here's where probably the computing community or the CSCW community can actually sort of brainstorm and come up with ways and means of, thinking through or creating this, skill requirements for audit. It's not for people like me, geographers and sociologists, to be telling a community like CSCW, this is how you do algorithmic audit, right?
Great, thank you for that response, and thank you for the keynote. It's been really enlightening. And I think on that note, I think we'll end this opening session. The good news to everyone is that there's going to be an encore session, and Balaji is going to be here again to answer questions in 12 hours. If you're interested in, if you think about additional questions that you'd like to ask. And so otherwise, we hope you enjoy the rest of the conference, and we look forward to meeting you all through GatherTown.
Okay, thank you, Tony. Thank you, Gary. And thanks everybody in the audience. It was great fun to deliver this talk, and thank you for all the great questions. Thank you.
Thank you.
Oh, thanks so much. Oh, did we lose him? I have a question. Balaji, are you still there? I'm asking quietly.
Yeah, I'm here. Yeah.
So, I mean, fantastic. Thank you so much for that talk. I mean, I think I want to tell you, I know you kind of had some uncertainty, but it's as you were talking, I got to tell you, like, it's so clear that the talk is absolutely relevant to the CSCW community. I mean, like, many of our colleagues, like, we use gig work to get some of the research itself done, and many of our other colleagues actually continue to do research on gig work as you do. And questions of transparency and fairness and equity are absolutely central questions in the CSCW community. So just wanted to tell you, like, absolutely core to this stuff. My question that I didn't get to ask earlier that I wanted to ask is, I was thinking about this, in Toronto, where we Amazon workers, they're not Amazon workers. They look like Amazon workers because the truck has Amazon on it, but same as what you were talking about. I don't know what the platform is, but basically they're all contractors. And as you said, like, exactly the same kinds of thing. Like, they're not working for Uber, but may as well be, right? Like, essentially, like, there's no health care benefits. It's like, finish 1 million of these deliveries in 10 hours to get your incentives and stuff. I mean, one of the things that I was thinking about was, I wonder if the dirty secret is that if these workers are paid fairly, that actually all of this collapses. Like, you know what I mean? Like, you can't afford all of this nicety without, the gig workers, suffering basically. Like, I wonder if that's basically just the dirty secret.
I think the jury is still out on that, because see, there are a couple of things that I would, the couple of ways of looking at that. Okay? One, maybe some platforms will indeed collapse because they're sort of built on shaky foundations. And to be sure, across the world, this is not just in India, right? All of them are surviving because they get pots of venture capital money that's cannot be invested in elsewhere, that is going into these businesses. Even Uber and Airbnb, I don't think have made any profit yet that they can actually showcase. Never mind their stock market valuation. That's a completely different story, right? That's all sort of future expectations. That was even the case for Amazon for 20 plus years before they showed any money coming through. So the thing is, it is quite possible that many of them will collapse. But I also am not quite sure, because see, at least in India, most of these companies are privately held companies. So if you want financial data on these companies, you have no idea where to even turn to. And even to sort of calculate how much venture capital is coming in is very hard, because the holdings of these companies are so incredibly complex. They have like so many subsidiaries, so money goes from one subsidiary to another, to another, to another. You really, it's quite a task for you. Certainly something that I'm not up to actually do all the tracing, right, about where the money comes. So we don't really know to what extent this model even works, frankly. Right? I'm sure some of them will collapse. Beyond that, I'm not able to say anything with any degree of definitiveness, right? And there's also another side to this, which, workers oftentimes are blocked when they say, oh, you've not done your job, you haven't delivered, or, some customer complained. On that note, these platforms will collapse because you can say that of all the people who are heading these companies, these guys who take home on a daily basis more than what the workers take home on a monthly basis. Considering that they have not done their basic task of running a profitable business, all of them should be locked out overnight. Right? That's another reason why the business will collapse. Not only because that they're not making enough money in their operations, but because the guys who are actually running the companies also have a lot to answer for in their ability to, or their inability to transform all this sort of money that they're getting into profitable outcomes. Right. So the thing is, this whole, I think, personally speaking, I would say that the hub-based models, because they're actually dealing with a lot more that is tangible, seem to be on firmer ground, at least so far, than these so-called asset-light models, which are really, for the most part, surviving, like I mentioned earlier, by transferring the burden of asset ownership on workers. And to the extent that workers become increasingly indebted, these companies are facing a lot of problems. The only reason they're surviving is because they can rely on a continuous stream of workers who are coming in, seeking work. And to the extent that that party ends, a lot of them are going to collapse. In fact, what we're trying to do is actually trying to raise the awareness even of these people who invest, like, for example, CalPERS, which is one of the biggest investors for this thing. Money comes from these large organizations. Oftentimes, they're even unaware of how these things happen, right? And sadly, there's also a close nexus between the state and these platforms. We are living in an ideological environment where these things no longer seem to matter as much, right? And where the state is sort of, abdicated really its responsibility, not just in India, but in most countries of the world, right? And in the process, actually playing a cheerleader to business, saying, we'll give you flexibility. Go ahead and operate as you see fit, right? So the thing is, there are, and actually there was a very recently a wonderful article in India about how, there is this sort of network of relationships through, school ties, school networks, through personal friendships, etc., between the state and the and these platform economy. And one of these platform economy executives told me, he said, you know what, the same executives are funding, the same venture capitalists are funding all of us platforms, right? So it's like a really clubby atmosphere and environment. And I think we do have to, what shall I say, put pressure from outside to, on regulators, do outreach to workers, raise their awareness of their conditions, and get them to sort of stand up, give them a voice, like the thing. That's why I resonated with what I saw earlier about the Iranian women. So it's, for me, I said, like, how is it that we can give a voice here to these guys, right? And so on. So yes, the short answer to your question, I see many of them will possibly collapse given the way that they're going.
I do have a follow-up question to that. And I think one of my
Getting some bonus questions in.
Yeah, sorry, we're just
bonus post-credits scenes.
No, go ahead, please go ahead. I love this.
One of my takeaways is that, despite these models all have these issues, at least the hub-based model seems to be a bit better than the asset-based models. That's kind of my takeaway from this. What are some of the factors that influence an organization or a platform to adapt hub-based model versus asset-based model?
Well, see, the thing is, a lot of these hub-based models are actually delivering stuff to you. Like, for instance, e-commerce platforms like Amazon or Flipkart, you want to order your phone or you want to order a book, etc., they're getting it to you, right? And you actually, or, you have grocery platforms that, there's something called Big Basket in India that supplies vegetables or, other sort of necessities for your kitchen. So these are guys who are actually, shipping stuff, and they need to store this. In other words, you need to have an inventory mechanism, and your worker cannot go directly to your house and deliver the service. He or she has to go to the hub, pick up the stuff, and come back and deliver it. Now, what it does is it raises the possibility for sort of workers to kind of get together, share certain things. But here too, again, and this is where, there are still problems. It's not all, it's all not hunky-dory, in the sense that I gave you the example of the Amazon worker who said he couldn't go to work a couple of days. They gave his ID to somebody else. And then when he went back the third day, they said, don't worry, I'll give you somebody else's ID. So the thing is, it is not that this kind of what I would call malpractice is not evident in the hub-based platform, but it's simply that you actually, the famous South African author said, there's a there, right? Whereas in the case of the provision of these services, there is no there. And these workers are, in these platforms, are as atomized as they can get. And this goes back to a reference I made to Manuel Castells. Essentially, in the pursuit of their work, right, they're highly atomized, right? And they can't get together, and even if they do, I mean, they're threatened because they're tracked all the time. Like I said, this whole thing about data opacity. So when you come on board, you share certain, maybe your basic driver's license and a bunch of other details. But over and above that, these platforms use, GPS, they track where you are, how, did you take a toilet break? Did you have a lunch break? They know pretty much everything about you. And these become kind of sources of threat, right? And see, of course, platform workers also push back. They do things like, switching between platforms. I drive for one guy in the morning, I drive for another, and so on and so forth. But often the choice becomes Tweedledum and Tweedledee, because the conditions of these platforms are not that different, especially in the asset-light platforms. You are operating on very, very low margins. And we'll have to see what happens, because especially, right now, if you see the conditions, we have just come out of the pandemic, and the pandemic, there are some platforms that did really well. And I think this goes back to the hub-based model. See, during the pandemic, and I'm sure you had similar experiences in North America, we couldn't go out. We were locked in at home, right? So no demand for ride hailing. We couldn't order food because the restaurants were all shut. So the ride hailing and the food delivery platforms just collapsed. The only guys who did well were the guys who were supplying you groceries or your other gifts if you wanted to order a phone or whatever. And it's the Amazons and the Flipkarts and the Big Baskets that were actually doing well and thriving, right? So the thing is that we are still coming out, maybe these things will change, but what we're seeing today, at least in India, is that these asset-light models are really the most fragile of the lot for all these sort of reasons I just spelled out. And I do think the hub-based models, because they have inventory they've got to carry, that they need to deliver, and they pay for the assets. Your driver isn't, your delivery guy isn't paying for those assets. That's a crucial difference.
Well, thank you so much.
I hope I answered that question, Gary.
You did. Thank you so much. And we've kept you here longer than probably you had planned. But we'll see you again in a few hours.
Definitely. Thank you so much. I really enjoyed it, and I hope you enjoyed it as much as I did.
We absolutely did.
Thank you so much.
All right, take care. I'll see you later in the
Okay,
evening.
thank you.
Goodbye. Cheers.
Have a Good day.
And for the rest of the attendees, if you're still here, have a good morning or good night wherever you are, and we hope to see you soon. Bye, everyone.
See you all. Bye-bye.